Master Voyeur," he laughed. "What are you still here for, boy? I'll bet you the same halfpenny that a question slowed you down."
"Why do we stop for the Greystones?"
"Tradition, my boy," he said grandly, throwing his arms wide. "And superstition. They are one and the same, anyway. We stop for good luck and because everyone enjoys an unexpected holiday." He paused. "I used to know a bit of a poem about them. How did it go? Like a drawstone even in our sleep, standing stone by old road is the way, to lead you ever deeper into fay. Laystone as you lay in hill or dell, Greystone leads to something L." My father stood for a second or two, looking off into space and tugging at his lower lip. Finally, he shook his head. "Can't remember the end of that last line. Lord, but I dislike poetry. How can anyone remember words that aren't put to music?" His forehead creased with concentration as he mouthed the words silently to himself. "What's a drawstone?" I asked. "It's an old name for lodenstones," my mother explained. "They're pieces of star iron that draw all other iron toward themselves. I saw one years ago in a curiosity cabinet." She looked up at my father, who was still muttering to himself. "We saw the lodenstone in Pelerezin, didn't we?" What?" The question jogged him out of his reverie. "Yes, Pelerezin." He tugged at his lip again and frowned. "Remember this, son, if you forget everything else. A poet is a musician who can't sing. Words have to find a man's mind before they can touch his heart, and some men's minds are woeful small targets. Music touches their hearts directly, no matter how small or stubborn the mind of the man who listens." My mother made a slightly unladylike snort. "Elitist. You're just getting old." She gave a dramatic sigh. "Truly, all the more's the tragedy. The second thing to go is a man's memory." My father puffed up to an indignant pose, but my mother ignored him and said to me, "Besides, the only tradition that keeps troops by the Greystone is laziness. The poem should run like this. Whatever the season that I'm on the road, I look for a reason, loden or laystone, to lay down my load." My father had a dark glimmer in his eye as he moved behind her. "Old?" He spoke in a low voice as he began to rub her shoulders again. "Woman, I have a mind to prove you wrong." She smiled a wry smile. "Sir, I have a mind to let you." I decided to leave them to their discussion and started to scamper back to Ben's wagon when I heard my father call out behind me, "Scales after lunch tomorrow, and the second act of Timberton." "Okay," I burst into a jog. When I got back to Ben's wagon, he had already unhitched Alpha and Beta and was rubbing them down. I started to set up the fire, surrounding dry leaves with a pyramid of progressively larger twigs and branches. When I was finished, I turned to where Ben sat. More silence. I could almost see him picking out his words as he spoke. "How much do you know about your father's new song?" "The one about Lanray?" I asked. "Not much. You know what he's like. No one hears it until it's finished. Not even me." "I'm not talking about the song itself," Ben said. "The story behind it. Lanray's story." I thought about the dozens of stories I'd heard my father collect over the last year, trying to pick out the common threads. "Lanray was a prince," I said. "Or a king, someone important. He wanted to be more powerful than anyone else in the world. He sold his soul for power, but then something went wrong, and afterward I think he went crazy, or he couldn't ever sleep again, or—" I stopped when I saw Ben shaking his head. "He didn't sell his soul," Ben said. "That's just nonsense." He heaved a great sigh that seemed to leave him deflated. "I'm doing this all wrong. Never mind your father's song. We'll talk about it after he finishes it. Knowing Lanray's story might give you some perspective. Ben took a deep breath and tried again. Suppose you have a thoughtless 6-year-old. What harm can he do? I paused, unsure what sort of answer he wanted. Straightforward would probably be best. Not much. Suppose he's 20 and still thoughtless. How dangerous is he? I decided to stick with the obvious answers. Still not much, but more than before. What if you give him a sword? Realization started to dawn on me, and I closed my eyes. More. Much more. I understand, Ben. Really, I do. Power is okay, and stupidity is usually harmless. Power and stupidity together are dangerous. I never said stupid, Ben corrected me. You're clever. We both know that. But you can be thoughtless. A clever, thoughtless person is one of the most terrifying things there is. Worse, I've been teaching you some dangerous things. Ben looked at the fire I'd laid out, then picked up a leaf, mumbled a few words, and watched a small flame flicker into life in the center of the twigs and tinder. He turned to look at me. You could kill yourself doing something as simple as that. He gave a sickly grin. Or looking for the name of the wind. He started to say something else, then stopped and rubbed his face with his hands. He gave a great sigh that seemed to deflate him. When he took his hands away, his face was tired. How old are you again? 12 next month. He shook his head. It's so easy to forget that. You don't act your age. He poked at the fire with a stick. I was 18 when I began at the university, he said. I was 20 before I knew as much as you do now. He stared into the fire. I'm sorry, Kvothe. I need to be alone tonight. I need to do some thinking. I nodded silently. I went to his wagon, gathered tripod and kettle, water and tea. I brought them back and quietly laid them beside Ben. He was still staring into the fire when I turned away. Knowing my parents wouldn't expect me back for a while, I headed into the forest. I had some thinking of my own to do. I owed Ben that much. I wished I could do more. It took a full span of days before Ben was his normal, jovial self again. But even then, things weren't the same between us. We were still fast friends, but there was something between us, and I could tell he was consciously holding himself apart. Lessons ground to a near standstill. He halted my fledgling study of alchemy, limiting me to chemistry instead. He refused to teach me any sigildry at all, and on top of everything else, he began to ration what little sympathy he thought safe for me. I chafed at the delays, but held my peace, trusting that if I showed myself to be responsible and meticulously careful, he would eventually relax and things would return to normal. We were family, and I knew that any trouble between us would eventually be smoothed over. All I needed was time. Little did I know that our time was quickly drawing to an end. Chapter 15. Distractions and Farewells. The town was called Hallowfell. We stopped for a handful of days because there was a good wainwright there, and nearly all our wagons needed tending or mending of some sort. While we were waiting, Ben got the offer he couldn't refuse. She was a widow, fairly wealthy, fairly young, and to my inexperienced eyes, fairly attractive. The official story was that she needed someone to tutor her young son. However, anyone who saw the two of them walking together knew the truth behind that story. She had been the brewer's wife, but he had drowned 2 years ago. She was trying to run the brewery as best she could, but she didn't really have the know-how to do a good job of it. As you can see, I don't think anyone could have built a better snare for Ben if they had tried. Plans were changed and the troops stayed on at Hallowfell for a few extra days. My 12th birthday was moved up and combined with Ben's going-away party. To truly understand what it was like, you must realize that nothing is so grand as a troupe showing off for one another. Good entertainers try to make each performance seem special, but you need to remember that the show they're putting on for you is the same one they've put on for hundreds of other audiences. Even the most dedicated troupes have an occasional lackluster performance, especially when they know they can get away with it. Small towns, rural inns, those places didn't know good entertainment from bad. Your fellow performers did. Think then, how do you entertain the people who have seen your act 1,000 times? You dust off the old tricks. You try out some new ones. You hope for the best, and of course, the grand failures are as entertaining as the great successes. I remember the evening as a wonderful blur of warm emotions, tinged in bitter. Fiddles, lutes, and drums, everyone played and danced and sang as they wished. I dare say we rivaled any fairy revel you can bring to mind. I got presents. Trip gave me a belt knife with a leather grip, claiming that all boys should have something they can hurt themselves with. Shandy gave me a lovely cloak she had made, scattered with little pockets for a boy's treasures. My parents gave me a lute, a beautiful thing of smooth, dark wood. I had to play a song, of course, and Ben sang with me. I slipped a little on the strings of the unfamiliar instrument, and Ben wandered off looking for notes once or twice, but it was nice. Ben opened up a small keg of mead he had been saving for just such an occasion. I remember it tasting the way I felt, sweet and bitter and sullen. Several people had collaborated to write The Ballad of Ben, Brewer Supreme. My father recited it as gravely as if it were the Modagan royal lineage, while accompanying himself on a half-harp. Everyone laughed until they hurt, and Ben twice as much as everyone else. At some point in the night, my mother swept me up and danced around in a great spinning circle. Her laughter sang out like music trailing in the wind. Her hair and skirt spun around me as she twirled. She smelled comforting, the way only mothers do. That smell and the quick laughing kiss she gave me did more to ease the dull ache of Ben's leaving than all the entertainments combined. Shandy offered to do a special dance for Ben, but only if he came into her tent to see it. I'd never seen Ben blush before, but he did it well. He hesitated, and when he refused, it was obviously about as easy for him as tearing out his own soul. Shandy protested and pouted prettily, saying she'd been practicing it for a long time. Finally, she dragged him into the tent, their disappearance encouraged by a cheer from the entire troop. Trip and Taryn staged a mock sword fight that was 1 part breathtaking swordplay, 1 part dramatic soliloquy, provided by Taryn, and 1 part buffoonery that I'm sure Trip must have invented on the spot. It ranged all over the camp. In the course of the fight, Trip managed to break his sword, hide under a lady's dress, fence with a sausage, and perform such fantastical acrobatics that it's a miracle he didn't seriously injure himself, although he did split his pants up the back. Dax set himself alight while attempting a spectacular bit of fire-breathing and had to be doused. All he suffered was a bit of singed beard and a slightly bruised pride. He recovered quickly under Ben's tender ministrations, a mug of mead, and a reminder that not everyone was cut out to have eyebrows. My parents sang the Lay of Sir Savian Tralliard. Like most of the great songs, Sir Savian was written by Ilion, and generally considered to be his crowning work. It's a beautiful song, made more so by the fact that I'd only heard my father perform the whole thing a handful of times before. It's hellishly complex, and my father was probably the only one in the troupe who could do it justice. Though he didn't particularly show it, I knew it was taxing even for him. My mother sang the counter-harmony, her voice soft and lilting. Even the fire seemed subdued when they took a breath. I felt my heart lift and dive. I wept as much for the glory of the 2 voices so perfectly enmeshed as for the tragedy of the song. Yes, I cried at the end of it. I did then, and I have every time since. Even a reading of the story aloud will bring tears to my eyes. In my opinion, anyone who isn't moved by it is less than human inside. There was a momentary quiet after they finished, wherein everyone wiped their eyes and blew their noses. Then, after a suitable period of recovery had elapsed, someone called out, "Lanray! Lanray!" The shout was taken up by several other people. "Yes, Lanray!" My father gave a wry smile and shook his head. He never performed any part of a song until it was finished. "Come on, Arl," Shandy called out. "You've been stewing it long enough. Let some out of the pot." He shook his head again, still smiling. "It's not ready yet." He bent down and carefully set his lute into its case. "Let's have a taste, Arliden." It was Terran this time. "Yeah, for Ben's sake. It's not fair that he should have to hear you mumble over it for all this while and not yet are wondering what you're doing in that wagon with your wife if it's not— Sing it! Lanray!" Tripp quickly organized the whole troop into a great chanting, howling mass that my father managed to withstand for almost a minute before he stooped and lifted his lute back out of the case. Everyone cheered. The crowd hushed as soon as he sat back down. He tuned a string or two, even though he'd only just set it down. He flexed his fingers and struck a few soft, experimental notes, then swept into the song so gently that I caught myself listening to it before I knew it had begun. Then my father's voice spoke over the rise and fall of the music. "Sit and listen all, for I will sing a story wrought and forgotten in a time old and gone, a story of a man, proud Lanray, strong as the spring, steel of the sword he had at ready hand. Hear how he fought, fell and rose again, to fall again, under shadow falling then. Love felled him, love for native land, and love of his wife Lyra, at whose calling some say he rose through doors of death to speak her name at his first reborn breath." My father drew a breath and paused, his mouth open as if he would continue. Then a wide, wicked grin spread across his face, and he bent to tuck his lute safely away. There was an outcry and a great deal of complaining, but everyone knew they had been lucky to hear as much as they had. Someone else struck up a song for dancing, and the protests faded away. My parents danced together, her head on his chest. Both had their eyes closed. They seemed so perfectly content. If you can find someone like that, someone who you can hold and close your eyes to the world with, then you're lucky, even if it only lasts for a minute or a day. The image of them gently swaying to the music is how I picture love in my mind even after all these years. Afterward, Ben danced with my mother, his steps sure and stately. I was struck by how beautiful they looked together. Ben, old, gray and portly, with his lined face and half-burned eyebrows. My mother slender, fresh and bright, pale and smooth-skinned in the firelight. They complemented each other by contrast. I ached knowing I might never see them together again. By this time the sky was beginning to brighten in the east. Everyone gathered to say their final goodbyes. I can't remember what I said to him before we left. I know it felt woefully inadequate, but I knew he understood. He made me promise not to get myself into any trouble tinkering with the things he had taught me. He stooped a bit and gave me a hug, then tousled my hair. I didn't even mind. In semi-retaliation, I tried to smooth out his eyebrows, something I'd always wanted to try. His expression was marvelous in its surprise. He gathered me into another hug. Then he stepped away. My parents promised to steer the troop back toward the town when we were in the area. All the troopers said they wouldn't need much steering, but even as young as I was, I knew the truth. It would be a great long time before I saw him again. Years. I don't remember starting out that morning, but I do remember trying to sleep and feeling quite alone except for a dull, bittersweet ache. When I awoke later in the afternoon, I found a package resting next to me. Wrapped in a sackcloth and tied with twine, there was a bright piece of paper with my name fixed to the top, waving in the wind like a little flag. Unwrapping it, I recognized the book's binding. It was Rhetoric and Logic, the book Ben had used to teach me argument. Out of his small library of a dozen books, it was the only one I hadn't read from cover to cover. I hated it. I cracked it open and saw writing on the inside cover. It said, Quoth, Defend yourself well at the university. Make me proud. Remember your father's song. Be wary of folly. Your friend, Abinthy. Ben and I had never discussed my attending the university. Of course, I had dreams of going there, someday. But they were dreams I hesitated to share with my parents. Attending the university would mean leaving my parents, my troop, everyone and everything I had ever known. Quite frankly, the thought was terrifying. What would it be like to settle in one place, not just for an evening or a span of days, but for months, years? No more performing? No tumbling with Trip or playing the bratty young noble's son in 3 pennies for wishing? No more wagons. No one to sing with. I'd never said anything aloud, but Ben would have guessed. I read his inscription again, cried a bit, and promised him that I would do my best. Chapter 16. Hope. Over the next 6 months, my parents did their best to patch the hole left by Ben's absence, bringing in the other troopers to fill my time productively and keep me from moping. You see, in the troop, age had little to do with anything. If you were strong enough to saddle the horses, you saddled the horses. If your hands were quick enough, you juggled. If you were clean-shaven and fit the dress, you played Lady Rathiel in The Swineherd and the Nightingale. Things were generally as simple as that. So Trip taught me how to jape and tumble. Shandy walked me through the courtly dances of a half-dozen countries. Taran measured me against the hilt of his sword and judged that I had grown tall enough to begin the basics of swordplay. Not enough to actually fight, he stressed, but enough so I could make a good show of it on stage. The roads were good this time of year, so we made excellent time traveling north through the Commonwealth. 15, 20 miles a day as we searched out new towns to play. With Ben gone, I rode with my father more often, and he began my formal training for the stage. I already knew a great deal, of course, but what I had picked up was an undisciplined hodgepodge. My father systematically went about showing me the true mechanics of the actor's trade, how slight changes in accent or posture make a man seem oafish, or sly, or silly. Lastly, my mother began teaching me how to comport myself in polite society. I knew a little from our infrequent stays with Baron Greyfallow, and thought I was quite genteel enough without having to memorize forms of address, table manners, and the elaborate snarled rakings of the peerage. Eventually, I told my mother exactly that. "Who cares if a Modagan Viscount outranks a vintage Sparathane?" I protested. "And who cares if one is Your Grace and the other is My Lord?" "They care," my mother said firmly. "If you perform for them, you need to conduct yourself with dignity and learn to keep your elbow out of the soup." "Father doesn't worry about which fork to use and who outranks who," I groused. My mother frowned, her eyes narrowing. "Who outranks whom?" I said grudgingly. "Your father knows more than he lets on," my mother said, "and what he doesn't know, he breezes past due to his considerable charm. That's how he gets by." She took my chin and turned my face toward her. Her eyes were green with a ring of gold around the pupil. "Do you just want to get by, or do you want to make me proud?" There was only one answer to that. Once I knuckled down to learn it, it was just another type of acting, another script. My mother made rhymes to help me remember the more nonsensical elements of etiquette. and together we wrote a dirty little song called "The Pontifex Always Ranks Under a Queen." We laughed over it for a solid month, and she strictly forbade me to sing it to my father, lest he play it in front of the wrong people some day and get us all into serious trouble. "Tree!" The shout came faintly down the line. "Three-weight oak!" My father stopped in the middle of the monologue he had been reciting for me and gave an irritated sigh. "That'll be as far as we get today, then," he grumbled, looking up at the sky. "Are we stopping?" my mother called from inside the wagon. "Another tree across the road," I explained. "I swear," my father said, steering the wagon to a clear space at the side of the road. "Is this the King's Road, or isn't it? You'd think we were the only people on it. How long ago was that storm? 2 span?" "Not quite," I said. 16 days. "And trees still blocking the road? I've a mind to send the consulate a bill for every tree we've had to cut and drag out of the way. This will put us another 3 hours behind schedule." He hopped from the wagon as it rolled to a halt. "I think it's nice," my mother said, walking around from the back of the wagon. "It gives us a chance for something hot." She gave my father a significant look. "To eat. It gets frustrating making do with whatever you can grab at the end of the day. A body wants more." My father's mood seemed to temper considerably. "There is that," he said. "Sweet," my mother called to me. "Do you think you could find me some wild sage?" "I don't know if it grows around here," I said with the proper amount of uncertainty in my voice. "No harm in looking," she said sensibly. She looked at my father from the corner of her eye. "If you can find enough, bring back an armload. We'll dry it for later." Typically, whether or not I found what I was looking for didn't matter very much. It was my habit to wander away from the troop in the evenings. I usually had some sort of errand to run while my parents set up for dinner, but it was just an excuse for us to get away from each other. Privacy is hard to come by on the road, and they needed it as much as I did. So if it took me an hour to gather an armload of firewood, they didn't mind. And if they hadn't started dinner by the time I came back, well, that was only fair, wasn't it? I hope they spent those last few hours well. I hope they didn't waste them on mindless tasks, kindling the evening fire and cutting vegetables for dinner. I hope they sang together, as they so often did. I hope they retired to our wagon and spent time in each other's arms. I hope they lay near each other afterward and spoke softly of small things. I hope they were together, busy with loving each other, until the end came. It's a small hope, and pointless, really. They are just as dead either way. Still, I hope. Let us pass over the time I spent alone in the woods that evening, playing games that children invent to amuse themselves. The last carefree hours of my life. The last moments of my childhood. Let us pass over my return to the camp just as the sun was beginning to set. The sight of bodies strewn about like broken dolls. The smell of blood and burning hair. How I wandered aimlessly about, too disoriented for proper panic, numb with shock and dread. I would pass over the whole of that evening, in fact. I would spare you the burden of any of it if one piece were not necessary to the story. It is vital. It is the hinge upon which the story pivots, like an opening door. In some ways, this is where the story begins. So let's have done with it. Scattered patches of smoke hung in the still evening air. It was quiet, as if everyone in the troop was listening for something, as if they were all holding their breath. An idle wind tussled the leaves in the trees and wafted a patch of smoke like a low cloud toward me. I stepped out of the forest and through the smoke, heading into the camp. I left the cloud of smoke and rubbed some of the sting from my eyes. As I looked around, I saw Tripp's tent lying half-collapsed and smoldering in his fire. The treated canvas burned fitfully, and the acrid gray smoke hung close to the ground in the quiet evening air. I saw Terran's body lying by his wagon, his sword broken in his hand. The green and gray he normally wore was wet and red with blood. One of his legs was twisted unnaturally, and the splintered bone showing through the skin was very, very white. I stood unable to look away from Terran, the gray shirt, the red blood, the white bone. I stared as if it were a diagram in a book I was trying to understand. My body grew numb. I felt as if I was trying to think through syrup. Some small, rational part of me realized I was in deep shock. It repeated the fact to me again and again. I used all Ben's training to ignore it. I did not want to think about what I saw. I did not want to know what had happened here. I did not want to know what any of this meant. After I don't know how long, a wisp of smoke broke my line of vision. I sat down next to the nearest fire in a daze. It was Shandy's fire, and a small pot hung simmering, boiling potatoes, strangely familiar among the chaos. I focused on the kettle. Something normal. I used a stick to poke at the contents and saw that they were finished cooking. Normal. I lifted the kettle from the fire and set it on the ground next to Shandy's body. Her clothes hung in tatters about her. I tried to brush her hair away from her face, and my hand came back sticky with blood. The firelight reflected in her flat, empty eyes. I stood and looked about aimlessly. Tripp's tent was entirely aflame by now, and Shandy's wagon was standing with one wheel in Marion's campfire. All the flames were tinged with blue, making the scene dreamlike and surreal. I heard voices. Peering around the corner of Shandy's wagon, I saw several unfamiliar men and women sitting around a fire. My parents' fire. A dizziness swept over me, and I reached out a hand to steady myself against the wagon's wheel. When I gripped it, the iron bands that reinforced the wheel crumbled in my hand, flaking away in gritty sheets of brown rust. When I pulled my hand away, the wheel creaked and began to crack. I stepped back as it gave way, the wagon splintering, as if its wood were rotten as an old stump. I now stood in full view of the fire. One of the men tumbled backward and came to his feet with his sword out. His motion reminded me of quicksilver rolling from a jar onto a tabletop, effortless and supple. His expression was intent, but his body was relaxed, as if he just stood and stretched. His sword was pale and elegant. When it moved, it cut the air with a brittle sound. It reminded me of the quiet that settles on the coldest days in winter when it hurts to breathe and everything is still. He was 24 feet from me, but I could see him perfectly in the fading light of sunset. I remember him as clearly as I remember my own mother, sometimes better. His face was narrow and sharp, with the perfect beauty of porcelain. His hair was shoulder-length, framing his face in loose curls the color of frost. He was a creature of winter's pale. Everything about him was cold and sharp and white. Except his eyes. They were black like a goat's, but with no iris. His eyes were like his sword, and neither one reflected the light of the fire or the setting sun. He relaxed when he saw me. He dropped the tip of his sword and smiled with perfect ivory teeth. It was the expression a nightmare wore. I felt a stab of feeling penetrate the confusion I clutched around me like a thick protective blanket. Something put both its hands deep into my chest and clutched. It may have been the first time in my life I was ever truly afraid. Back by the fire, a bald man with a gray beard chuckled. "Looks like we've missed a little rabbit. Careful, Cinder. His teeth may be sharp." The one called Cinder sheathed his sword with the sound of a tree cracking under the weight of winter ice. Keeping his distance, he knelt. Again I was reminded of the way Mercury moved. Now on eye level with me, his expression grew concerned behind his matte black eyes. "What's your name, boy?" I stood there, mute, frozen as a startled fawn. Cinder sighed and dropped his gaze to the ground for a moment. When he looked back up at me, I saw pity staring at me with hollow eyes. "Young man," he said, "wherever are your parents?" He held my gaze for a moment and then looked over his shoulder back toward the fire where the others sat. "Does anyone know where his parents are?" Some of them smiled, hard and brittle, as if enjoying a particularly good joke. One or two of them laughed aloud. Cinder turned back to me, and the pity fell away like a cracked mask, leaving only the nightmare smile upon his face. "Is this your parents' fire?" he asked with a terrible delight in his voice. I nodded numbly. His smile slowly faded. Expressionless, he looked deep into me. His voice was quiet, cold, and sharp. "Someone's parents," he said, "have been singing entirely the wrong sort of songs." "Cinder." A cool voice came from the direction of the fire. His black eyes narrowed in irritation. "What?" he hissed. "You're approaching my displeasure. This one has done nothing. Send him to the soft and painless blanket of his sleep." The cool voice caught slightly on the last word, as if it were difficult to say. The voice came from a man who sat apart from the rest, wrapped in shadow at the edge of the fire. Though the sky was still bright with sunset and nothing stood between the fire and where he sat, shadow pooled around him like thick oil. The fire snapped and danced, lively and warm, tinged with blue, but no flicker of its light came close to him. The shadow gathered thicker around his head. I could catch a glimpse of a deep cowl like some priests wear, but underneath, the shadows were so deep it was like looking down a well at midnight. Cinder glanced briefly at the shadowed man, then turned away. "You are as good as a watcher, Heliax," he snapped. "And you seem to forget our purpose," the dark man said, his cool voice sharpening. "Or does your purpose simply differ from my own?" The last words were spoken carefully, as if they held special significance. Cinder's arrogance left him in a second, like water poured from a bucket. "No," he said, turning back toward the fire. "No, certainly not." "That is good. I hate to think of our long acquaintance coming to an end." "As do I." "Refresh me again as to our relationship, Cinder," the shadowed man said, a deep sliver of anger running through his patient tone. I am in your service." Cinder made a placating gesture. "You are a tool in my hand," the shadowed man interrupted gently. "Nothing more." A hint of defiance touched Cinder's expression. He paused. The soft voice went as hard as a rod of Ramston steel. "Ferula." Cinder's quicksilver grace disappeared. He staggered, his body suddenly rigid with pain. "You are a tool in my hand," the cool voice repeated. "Say it." Cinder's jaw clenched angrily for a moment. Then he convulsed and cried out, sounding more like a wounded animal than a man. "I am a tool in your hand," he gasped. "Lord Haliax." "I am a tool in your hand, Lord Haliax," Cinder amended as he crumpled, trembling to his knees. "Who knows the inner turnings of your name, Cinder?" The words were spoken with a slow patience, like a schoolmaster reciting a forgotten lesson. Cinder wrapped shaking arms around his midsection and hunched over, closing his eyes. "You, Lord Haliax!" "Who keeps you safe from the Emir? The singers? The scythe? from all that would harm you in the world? Haliax asked with a calm politeness, as if genuinely curious as to what the answer might be.
You, Lord Haliax!
Cinder's voice was a quiet shred of pain. And whose purpose do you serve?
Your purpose, Lord Haliax!
The words were choked out.
Yours, none other.
The tension left the air, and Cinder's body suddenly went slack. He fell forward onto his hands, and beads of sweat fell from his face to patter on the ground like rain. His white hair hung limp around his face.
Thank you, Lord,
he gasped out earnestly.
I will not forget again.
You will. You are too fond of your little cruelties. All of you. Haliax's hooded face swept back and forth to look at each of the figures sitting around the fire. They stirred uncomfortably. I am glad I decided to accompany you today. You are straying, indulging in whimsy. Some of you seem to have forgotten what it is we seek, what we wish to achieve. The others sitting around the fire stirred uneasily. The hood turned back to Cinder. But you have my forgiveness. Perhaps if not for these remindings, it would be I who would forget. There was an edge to the last of his words. Now finish what... His cool voice trailed away as his shadowed hood slowly tilted to look toward the sky. There was an expectant silence. Those sitting around the fire grew perfectly still, their expressions intent. In unison, they tilted their heads as if looking at the same point in the twilight sky, as if trying to catch the scent of something on the wind. A feeling of being watched pulled at my attention. I felt a tenseness, a subtle change in the texture of the air. I focused on it, glad for the distraction, glad for anything that might keep me from thinking clearly for just a few more seconds. They come, Haliax said quietly. He stood, and shadows seemed to boil outward from him like a dark fog. Quickly, to me. The others rose from their seats around the fire. Cinder scrambled to his feet and staggered a half-dozen steps toward the fire. Haliax spread his arms, and the shadows surrounding him bloomed like a flower unfolding. Then each of the others turned with a studied ease and took a step toward Haliax, into the shadows surrounding him. But as their feet came down, they slowed, and gently, as if they were made of sand with wind blowing across them, they faded away. Only Cinder looked back, a hint of anger in his nightmare eyes. Then they were gone. I will not burden you with what followed. How I ran from body to body, frantically feeling for the signs of life as Ben had taught me. My futile attempt at digging a grave. How I scrabbled in the dirt until my fingers were bloody and raw. How I found my parents. It was in the darkest hours of the night when I found our wagon. Our horse had dragged it nearly 100 yards down the road before he died. It seemed so normal inside, so tidy and calm. I was struck by how much the back of the wagon smelled like the two of them. I lit every lamp and candle in the wagon. The light was no comfort, but it was the honest gold of real fire, untinged with blue. I took down my father's loot case. I lay in my parents' bed with the loot beside me. My mother's pillow smelled of her hair, of an embrace. I did not mean to sleep, but sleep took me. I woke coughing with everything in flames around me. It had been the candles, of course. Still numb with shock, I gathered a few things into a bag. I was slow and aimless, unafraid as I pulled Ben's book from under my burning mattress. What horror could a simple fire hold for me now? I put my father's loot into its case. I felt like I was stealing, but I couldn't think of anything else that would remind me of them. Both their hands had brushed its wood 1,000 times. Then I left. I walked into the forest and kept going until dawn began to brighten the eastern edges of the sky. As the birds began to sing, I stopped and set down my bag. I brought out my father's lute and clutched it to my body. Then I began to play. My fingers hurt, but I played anyway. I played until my fingers bled on the strings. I played until the sun shone through the trees. I played until my arms ached. I played, trying not to remember, until I fell asleep. Chapter 17. Interlude. Autumn. Kvothe held out a hand to Chronicler, then turned to his student, frowning. "Stop looking at me like that, Bast." Bast looked close to tears. "Oh, Reshi," he choked out. "I had no idea." Kvothe gestured as if cutting the air with the side of his hand. "There's no reason you should, Bast, and no reason to make an issue of it." "But Reshi—" Kvothe gave his student a severe look. "What, Bast? Should I weep and tear my hair, curse Telu and his angels, beat my chest? No, that is low drama." His expression softened somewhat. "I appreciate your concern, but this is just a piece of the story, not even the worst piece, and I'm not telling it to garner sympathy." Kvothe pushed his chair back from the table and came to his feet. "Besides, all of this happened long ago." He made a dismissive gesture. "Time is the great healer, and so on." He rubbed his hands together. "Now, I'm going to bring in enough wood to get us through the night. There'll be a chill if I'm any judge of weather. You can get a couple of loaves ready to bake while I'm out, and try to collect yourself. I refuse to tell the rest of this story with you making blubbery cow eyes at me." With that, Kvothe walked behind the bar and out through the kitchen toward the back door of the inn. Bast scrubbed roughly at his eyes, then watched his master go. "He's fine so long as he's busy," Bast said softly. "I beg your pardon?" Chronicler said reflexively. He shifted awkwardly in his seat, as if he wanted to get to his feet, but couldn't think of a polite way to excuse himself. Bast gave a warm smile, his eyes a human blue again. "I was so excited when I heard who you were, that he was going to tell his story. His mood's been so dark lately, and there's nothing to shake him out of it, nothing to do but sit and brood. I'm sure that remembering the good times will—" Bast grimaced. "I'm not saying this very well. I'm sorry for earlier. I wasn't thinking straight." No, Chronicler stammered hastily. "I'm the one. It was my fault. I'm sorry." Bast shook his head. "You were just surprised, but you only tried to bind me." His expression grew a little pained. "Not that it was pleasant, mind. It feels like being kicked between your legs, but all over your body. It makes you feel sick and weak, but it's just pain. It wasn't like you'd actually wounded me." Bast looked embarrassed. "I was going to do more than hurt you. I might have killed you before I even stopped to think." Before an uncomfortable silence developed, Chronicler said, "Why don't we take his word that we were both suffering from blinding idiocy and leave it at that?" Chronicler managed a sickly smile that was heartfelt in spite of the circumstances. "Peace?" He extended his hand. "Peace." They shook hands with much more genuine warmth than they had earlier. As Bast reached across the table, his sleeve pulled back to reveal a bruise blossoming around his wrist. Bast self-consciously pulled his cuff back into place. "From when he grabbed me," he said quickly. "He's stronger than he looks. Don't mention it to him. He'll only feel bad." Kvothe emerged from the kitchen and shut the door behind himself. Looking around, he seemed surprised that it was a mild autumn afternoon rather than the springtime forest of his story. He lifted the handles of a flat-bottomed barrow and trundled it out into the woods behind the inn, his feet crunching in the fallen leaves. Not too far into the trees was the winter's wood supply. Cord on cord of oak and ash were stacked to make tall, crooked walls between the trunks of trees. Kvothe tossed 2 pieces of firewood into the wheelbarrow, where they struck the bottom like a muted drum. Another 2 followed them. His motions were precise, his face blank, his eyes far away. As he continued to load the barrow, he moved slower and slower, like a machine winding down. Eventually, he stopped completely and stood for a long minute, still as stone. Only then did his composure break, and even with no one there to see, he hid his face in his hands and wept quietly, his body racked with wave on wave of heavy, silent sobs. Chapter 18. Roads to Safe Places. Perhaps the greatest faculty our minds possess is the ability to cope with pain. Classic thinking teaches us of the 4 doors of the mind which everyone moves through according to their need. First is the door of sleep. Sleep offers us a retreat from the world and all its pain. Sleep marks passing time, giving us distance from the things that have hurt us. When a person is wounded, they will often fall unconscious. Similarly, someone who hears traumatic news will often swoon or faint. This is the mind's way of protecting itself from pain by stepping through the first door. Second is the door of forgetting. Some wounds are too deep to heal, or too deep to heal quickly. In addition, many memories are simply painful, and there is no healing to be done. The saying, "Time heals all wounds," is false. Time heals most wounds. The rest are hidden behind this door. Third is the door of madness. There are times when the mind is dealt such a blow that it hides itself in insanity. While this may not seem beneficial, it is. There are times when reality is nothing but pain, and to escape that pain, the mind must leave reality behind. Last is the door of death, the final resort. Nothing can hurt us after we are dead, or so we've been told. After my family was killed, I wandered deep into the forest and slept. My body demanded it, and my mind used the first door to dull the pain. The wound was covered until the proper time for healing could come. In self-defense, a good portion of my mind simply stopped working. Went to sleep, if you will. While my mind slept, many of the painful parts of the previous day were ushered through the second door. Not completely. I did not forget what had happened, but the memory was dulled, as if seen through thick gauze. If I wanted to, I could have brought to memory the faces of the dead, the memories of the man with black eyes, but I did not want to remember. I pushed those thoughts away and let them gather dust in a seldom-used corner of my mind. I dreamed, not of blood, glassy eyes, and the smell of burning hair, but of gentler things, and slowly the wound began to grow numb. I dreamed I was walking through the forest with plain-faced Lackleth, the woodsman who had traveled with our troop when I was younger. He walked silently through the underbrush while I kicked up more noise than a wounded ox dragging an overturned cart. After a long period of comfortable silence, I stopped to look at a plant. He came quietly up behind me. "Sagebeard," he said. "You can tell by the edge." He reached past me and gently stroked the appropriate part of the leaf. It did look like a beard. I nodded. "This is willow. You can chew the bark to lessen pains." It was bitter and slightly gritty. "This is itchroot. Don't touch the leaves." I didn't. "This is baneberry. The small fruits are safe to eat when red, but never when shading from green to yellow to orange. This is how you set your feet when you want to walk silently." It made my calves ache. "This is how you part the brush quietly, leaving no sign of your passing. This is where you find the dry wood. This is how you keep the rain off you when you don't have canvas. This is pater root. You can eat it, but it tastes bad. These," he gestured, "straight rod, orange stripe. Never eat them. The one with the little knobs on it is burrum. You should only eat it if you have just eaten something like straight rod. It will make you kick up whatever's in your stomach. This is how you set a snare that won't kill a rabbit. This snare will." He looped the string first one way, then another. As I watched his hands manipulate the string, I realized it was no longer Lackleth, but Abinthy. We were riding in the wagon, and he was teaching me how to tie sailor's knots. "Knots are interesting things," Ben said as he worked. "The knot will either be the strongest or the weakest part of the rope. It depends entirely on how well one makes the binding." He held up his hands, showing me an impossibly complex pattern spread between his fingers. His eyes glittered. "Any questions?" "Any questions?" my father said. We had stopped early for the day because of a greystone. He sat tuning his lute and was finally going to play his song for my mother and me. We had been waiting so long. "Are there any questions?" he repeated as he sat with his back against the great gray stone. "Why do we stop at the waystones?" "Tradition, mostly. But some people say they marked old roads." My father's voice changed and became Ben's voice. "Safe roads. Sometimes roads to safe places. Sometimes safe roads leading into danger." Ben held one hand out to it, as if feeling the warmth of a fire. "But there is power in them. Only a fool would deny that." Then Ben was no longer there, and there was not one standing stone, but many, more than I had ever seen in one place before. They formed a double circle around me. One stone was set across the top of two others, forming a huge arch with thick shadow beneath. I reached out to touch it, and awoke. My mind had covered a fresh pane with the names of 100 roots and berries, 4 ways to light a fire, 9 snares made from nothing but a sapling and string, and where to find fresh water. I thought very little on the other matter of the dream. Ben had never taught me sailor's knots. My father had never finished his song. I took inventory of what I had with me: a canvas sack, a small knife, a ball of string, some wax, a copper penny, 2 iron shims, and Rhetoric and Logic, the book Ben had given me. Aside from my clothes and my father's lute, I had nothing else. I set out to look for drinking water. "Water comes first," Lackleth had told me. "Anything else you can do without for days." I considered the lay of the land and followed some animal trails. By the time I found a small spring-fed pool nestled among some birch trees, I could see the sky purpling into dusk behind the trees. I was terribly thirsty, but caution won out, and I took only a small drink. Next, I collected dry wood from the hollows of trees and under canopies. I set a simple snare. I hunted for and found several stalks of motherleaf and spread the sap onto my fingers where they were bloody and torn. The stinging helped distract me from remembering how I had hurt them. Waiting for the sap to dry, I took my first casual look around. Oaks and birches crowded each other for space. Their trunks made patterns of alternating light and dark beneath the canopy of branches. A small rivulet ran from the pool across some rocks and away to the east. It may have been beautiful, but I didn't notice. I couldn't notice. To me, the trees were shelter, the undergrowth a source of nourishment, and the pool reflecting moonlight only reminded me of my thirst. There was also a great rectangular stone lying on its side near the pool. A few days earlier, I would have recognized it as a gray stone. Now, I saw it as an efficient windbreak, something to put my back against as I slept. Through the canopy, I saw the stars were out. That meant it had been several hours since I had tried the water. Since it hadn't made me sick, I decided it must be safe and took a long drink. Rather than refreshing me, all my drink did was make me aware of how hungry I was. I sat on the stone by the edge of the pool. I stripped the leaves from the stalks of motherleaf and ate one. It was rough, papery, and bitter. I ate the rest, but it didn't help. I took another drink of water, then lay down to sleep, not caring that the stone was cold and hard, or at least pretending not to care. I awoke, took a drink, and went to check the snare I had set. I was surprised to find a rabbit already struggling against the cord. I took out my small knife and remembered how Lackleth had shown me to dress a rabbit. Then I thought of the blood and how it would feel on my hands. I felt sick and vomited. I cut loose the rabbit and walked back to the pool. I took another drink of water and sat on the stone. I felt a little light-headed and wondered if it was from hunger. After a moment, my head cleared and I chided myself for my foolishness. I found some shelf fungus growing on a dead tree and ate it after washing it in the pool. It was gritty and tasted like dirt. I ate all I could find. I set a new snare, one that would kill. Then, smelling rain in the air, I returned to the greystone to make a shelter for my loot. Chapter 19. Fingers and Strings. In the beginning, I was almost like an automaton, thoughtlessly performing the actions that would keep me alive. I ate the second rabbit I caught, and the third. I found a patch of wild strawberries. I dug for roots. By the end of the fourth day, I had everything I needed to survive. A stone-lined fire pit, a shelter for my loot. I had even assembled a small stockpile of foodstuffs that I could fall back on in case of emergency. I also had one thing I did not need: time. After I had taken care of immediate needs, I found I had nothing to do. I think this is when a small part of my mind started to slowly reawaken itself. Make no mistake, I was not myself. At least, I was not the same person I had been a span of days before. Everything I did, I attended to with my whole mind, leaving no part of me free for remembering. I grew thinner and more ragged. I slept in rain or sun, on soft grass, moist earth, or sharp stones, with an intensity of indifference that only grief can promote. The only notice I took of my surroundings was when it rained, because then I could not bring out my lute to play, and that pained me. Of course I played. It was my only solace. By the end of the first month, my fingers had calluses hard as stones, and I could play for hours upon hours. I played and played again all the songs I knew from memory. Then I played the half-remembered songs as well, filling in the forgotten parts as best I could. Eventually, I could play from when I woke until the time I slept. I stopped playing the songs I knew and started inventing new ones. I had made up songs before. I had even helped my father compose a verse or two, but now I gave it my whole attention. Some of those songs have stayed with me to this day. Soon after that, I began playing... How can I describe it? I began to play something other than songs. When the sun warms the grass and the breeze cools you, it feels a certain way. I would play until I got the feeling right. I would play until it sounded like warm grass and cool breeze. I was only playing for myself, but I was a harsh audience. I remember spending nearly 3 whole days trying to capture wind turning a leaf. By the end of the second month, I could play things nearly as easily as I saw and felt them. Sun setting behind the clouds, bird taking a drink, dew in the bracken. Somewhere in the third month, I stopped looking outside and started looking inside for things to play. I learned to play Riding in the Wagon with Ben, singing with Father by the fire, watching Shandy dance, grinding leaves when it's nice outside, Mother smiling. Needless to say, playing these things hurt, but it was a hurt like tender fingers on lute strings. I bled a bit and hoped that I would callous soon. Toward the end of summer, one of the strings broke beyond repair. I spent the better part of the day in a mute stupor, unsure of what to do. My mind was still numb and mostly asleep. I focused with a dim shadow of my usual cleverness on my problem. After realizing that I could neither make a string nor acquire a new one, I sat back down and began to learn to play